It rarely happens during the breakup. It rarely happens after the last conversation. And it almost never happens the first time you stop reaching out. The emotional shift that affects an avoidant the most usually arrives much later. It begins with something so ordinary. They almost overlook it. You respond differently. Or you don't respond at all. At first, that doesn't seem important. People become busy. Life gets in the way. Everyone needs space sometimes. But slowly, small changes begin forming a larger picture. The warmth they quietly expected feels different. The emotional availability they once assumed would always exist is no longer there. The conversations feel lighter, shorter, less emotionally dependent. There is no hidden frustration, no attempt to convince them, no subtle effort to pull them closer. Something has changed, and they can't quite explain what it is. Most people assume avoidants notice emotional change the moment it happens. They often don't. Avoidant attachment tends to focus on immediate emotional regulation, not immediate emotional interpretation. While the relationship is active, their attention is often directed toward managing closeness, finding enough emotional space to feel comfortable, reducing internal pressure, creating distance when vulnerability becomes difficult to sustain. Because of that, they can easily miss the gradual changes taking place in the other person. Not because they don't care, because their attention is directed somewhere else. But emotional patterns never stay still forever. Eventually, the nervous system notices something different. The relationship no longer feels emotionally familiar. The dynamic has quietly shifted. The person who once waited is no longer waiting. The person who once explained everything no longer feels the need to explain. The person who once carried the emotional weight of the relationship has gently put it down. That realization doesn't usually arrive as one dramatic moment. It arrives through contrast, a message that feels unexpectedly calm, a conversation without emotional urgency, a goodbye that sounds genuinely peaceful. For the first time, they are not sensing emotional pursuit. They are sensing emotional independence. And those are not the same thing. Pursuit says, "Please don't leave." Independence quietly says, "I'll be okay either way." That emotional difference is profound because for the first time, the avoidant is no longer reacting to pressure. They are reacting to absence, not the absence of communication, the absence of emotional dependence. And that changes the entire psychological landscape. Because once someone no longer needs reassurance from you, you begin seeing them through completely different eyes. Not as someone waiting for your decision, but as someone who has already begun making their own. That is often the emotional shift avoidants never expect. Not losing the relationship, realizing the person they thought would always emotionally orbit around them has quietly found a new center of gravity. That realization is rarely immediate. In fact, it often begins with confusion because the avoidant is not expecting you to become emotionally unavailable. They are expecting you to become emotionally quieter. There is a difference. Someone who is emotionally quiet may still be waiting, still hoping, still leaving the door open. But someone who has genuinely changed carries themselves differently. You can feel it without a single word being spoken. The urgency disappears. The emotional negotiations disappear. Even disappointment begins losing its intensity. For someone with an avoidant attachment pattern, this can be surprisingly difficult to understand because throughout much of the relationship, they unconsciously learn something, whether they intended to or not. They learned that the emotional connection would still be there. If they needed space, you would probably understand. If they became distant, you would probably reach out. If they hesitated, you would probably wait. This wasn't always manipulation. Most of the time, it wasn't conscious at all. It simply became the emotional pattern both people slowly stepped into. One person moved away, the other moved closer. One protected themselves with distance. The other protected the relationship with persistence. Over time, both roles began feeling normal, predictable, almost automatic. That is why the emotional shift feels so significant. It quietly interrupts a pattern that may have existed for months or even years. Suddenly, the person who always moved toward the relationship is no longer doing it. Not because they are trying to prove a point, not because they are hoping to create jealousy, because something inside them has genuinely changed. That difference matters. People can sense when behavior is strategic, but they can also sense when it is authentic. Authentic change has a certain calmness to it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists. And that quiet confidence often creates more psychological impact than any dramatic goodbye ever could. The avoidant begins noticing small things. You no longer rush to explain misunderstandings. You no longer seem emotionally shaken by every period of silence. Your conversations no longer revolve around seeking reassurance. You sound lighter, not because the relationship suddenly stopped matching, because your emotional well-being is no longer depending on its outcome. That is an enormous shift, because healthy emotional independence changes the entire dynamic between two people. For the first time, the avoidant is interacting with someone who is choosing connection rather than needing it. Those are completely different experiences. Need often creates pressure. Choice creates freedom. Ironically, freedom is something avoidants deeply value. Yet when they encounter it in another person, it can challenge assumptions they never realized they were carrying. Because now, they are no longer deciding how much emotional distance exists between the two of you. You are, not through control, through acceptance. Acceptance quietly redistributes emotional power. The relationship is no longer being held together by one person's willingness to keep reaching. It now depends on whether both people are equally willing to participate. That can feel unfamiliar, especially if the old dynamic lasted a long time. There is another psychological shift taking place beneath the surface. When someone stops chasing, our brain loses one of its strongest sources of certainty. Human beings naturally adapt to predictable patterns. We assume tomorrow will look similar to yesterday. The familiar becomes invisible until it changes. Then suddenly, everything that once felt ordinary becomes impossible to ignore. That is exactly what happens here. The emotional consistency they quietly depended upon is no longer guaranteed. Not because you became unavailable, because you became emotionally self-directed. Your peace no longer rises and falls with every interaction. Your confidence no longer depends on whether they move closer or further away. Your life has begun expanding beyond the relationship itself. And this is where many avoidants experience an emotional shift they never expected. They are no longer wondering whether you still care. They begin wondering something much more unsettling. What if they no longer need me in the way they once did? That question reaches much deeper than uncertainty, because it quietly reveals something they had never fully considered before. While they believed they were protecting their independence, you had been quietly building yours. That is where the emotional balance begins changing. Not because one person suddenly becomes stronger than the other, because the relationship is no longer being carried by only one nervous system. For a long time, your emotional responses may have been predictable. If they became distant, you felt anxious. If they pulled away, You try to understand. If they became emotionally unavailable, you search for ways to restore the connection. Those reactions were never signs of weakness. They were signs of someone trying to preserve something they believed was valuable. But healing has a remarkable way of changing what feels necessary. As your emotional security grows, your reactions begin changing naturally, not intentionally, naturally. You no longer feel responsible for fixing every emotional disconnect. You no longer assume every silence needs to be interpreted. You stop believing that someone else's inability to stay emotionally present is your responsibility to solve. That realization is incredibly freeing because it gives you something many people don't realize they have been missing: emotional permission. Permission to stop carrying what was never yours to carry. Permission to let another person's choices belong to them. Permission to believe that love should not require constant emotional rescue. As that permission becomes part of your everyday life, your energy begins changing. You become calmer, not because life suddenly becomes easier, because you stop fighting battles that no longer belong to you. And people notice that kind of change, not through dramatic conversations, through presence. A calm person feels different. They don't rush. They don't chase certainty. They don't panic when someone creates distance. Their stability quietly changes every interaction around them. For an avoidant, this can feel unexpectedly disorienting because the emotional rhythm they had grown accustomed to has disappeared. The relationship no longer follows the pattern their nervous system had quietly learned to expect. Distance no longer creates pursuit. Silence no longer creates urgency. Uncertainty no longer creates emotional panic. Instead, they are met with something far less familiar: consistency. You respond if you choose to. You step back if you need to. Your decisions are no longer driven by fear of losing the relationship. They are guided by respect for your own emotional well-being. That difference is impossible to fake, which is why it often creates such a powerful psychological impact. There is another reason this shift feels so significant. When someone stops chasing, it quietly removes an emotional mirror. Throughout the relationship, your reactions may have helped the avoidant understand their own importance, not because they wanted reassurance, because human beings naturally learn about themselves through the responses of others. When those familiar responses disappear, the mirror changes. Now, instead of seeing someone waiting, they see someone living, someone making plans, building friendships, finding joy, growing into a life that no longer revolves around uncertainty. That can create an uncomfortable realization, not because you rejected them, because your happiness is no longer dependent on whether they participate in it. At some point, they begin recognizing something they never expected. Your emotional world has become internally anchored. It no longer rises and falls according to their availability. And once that becomes clear, the relationship begins looking completely different from where they stand. Because for the first time, they are not wondering whether they need more space. They are wondering whether there is still space left for them. That question is not born from losing control. It is born from realizing that while they were trying to preserve their independence, you quietly discovered something even more powerful: the ability to love someone without losing yourself in the process. And that is where everything finally comes into focus. Because what many people call the emotional shift isn't actually about becoming emotionally unavailable. It is about becoming emotionally whole. Those are very different things. Becoming emotionally unavailable means closing your heart, building walls, refusing connection because you're afraid of being hurt again. Becoming emotionally whole means something entirely different. It means your happiness no longer depends on someone else's uncertainty. It means you can love deeply without making another person's choices the center of your emotional world. That is the shift avoidants rarely expect, because throughout much of the relationship, the emotional gravity seemed predictable. If they stepped back, you stepped forward. If they became uncertain, you searched for certainty. If they withdrew, you worked harder to restore closeness. That pattern may have lasted for months, sometimes years. Then one day, without any dramatic announcement, the pattern quietly disappears. Not because you decided to play a game, not because you finally found the perfect response, because healing slowly changed what your nervous system needed. You stopped confusing love with emotional endurance. You stopped believing that proving your loyalty required abandoning your peace. You stopped measuring the future of your life by another person's ability to face their fears. That transformation changes more than a relationship. It changes your identity. For the first time, your decisions begin coming from self-respect. Instead of fear, you no longer ask, "How do I keep this person close?" You begin asking, "Does this relationship allow both of us to grow?" That is a completely different question, because it shifts the focus away from preserving the relationship at any cost toward protecting the emotional health of both people inside it. And healthy love requires that. Not one person carrying the emotional weight. Not one person constantly adapting while the other constantly retreats. Real intimacy asks both people to move toward each other, even if those steps are small, even if they are imperfect, even if they are taken with fear. That is how trust is built, not through perfect timing, but through mutual willingness. For many avoidants, seeing this shift can become an unexpected turning point because they are no longer looking at someone waiting to be chosen. They are looking at someone who has already chosen themselves. That realization can be deeply confronting, not because confidence is intimidating, because it quietly removes every illusion that the relationship could simply resume where it left off. Life has continued. Healing has continued. Growth has continued. The emotional version of you they once knew no longer exists in quite the same way. And that is not something to feel guilty about. It is something to be proud of. Because every difficult day, every moment you wanted to reach out, but chose your peace instead, every boundary you kept when it would have been easier to let it go, was shaping the person you are today. Growth is rarely visible while you're living through it. But one day, you look back and realize the relationship is no longer defining your future. It has simply become part of your story, a chapter that taught you what healthy love should never require. If there is one truth worth remembering from this conversation, it is this: the greatest emotional shift is not when someone finally notices your value. It is when you stop needing them to. Because the moment your worth is no longer waiting for another person's recognition, you become emotionally free. And emotional freedom is something no one can give you, and no one can take away. If this conversation helped you see avoidant attachment through a deeper psychological lens, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey. Every week, we explore attachment theory, relationship psychology, emotional intelligence, human behavior, and the hidden emotional patterns that shape the way we love, connect, and heal. And before you go, I'd like to leave you with one final question. What do you think is the moment someone truly changes? Is it when the other person finally realizes your value, or when you no longer need them to? Share your thoughts in the comments. Some of the most powerful insights don't come from the video itself. They come from the conversations we have together afterward. Because sometimes, the most important relationship you will ever rebuild is the one you have with yourself.